The rain wasn't a downpour. Not yet. It was a cold, persistent drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. For Specialist Ilara Vance, a title she wore like an ill-fitting coat, the rain was a familiar adversary. She stood at parade rest on the edge of the asphalt drill square, her gaze fixed on the gray horizon beyond the razor wire of Fort Gentry. She had been sent out here an hour ago, ordered to verify the serial number on the outer perimeter floodlight by a trio of fresh-faced recruits who found her quiet presence in the logistics office an affront to their burgeoning military pride. The floodlight, of course, was perfectly fine. The real reason was to put the new civilian analyst in her place. They thought she was soft, a paper pusher sent to complicate their lives with inventory audits. They forced her to stand in the rain, a petty act of dominance. And so she stood, motionless, letting the water bead on her simple gray jacket. But this humiliation was a temporary state, a pressure she had endured in far worse forms. Soon, everything would change. Soon, a ghost from her past would arrive, and the salute he would give her would shatter their small world. The water trickled down her neck, a cold finger tracing her spine, but Ilara remained impassive. Her stillness was not born of submission, but of a discipline so deeply ingrained it had become part of her physiology. Her breathing was slow and even, each inhale a measured intake of damp, earthy air, each exhale a ghost of white vapor in the chill. The recruits, led by a cocky private named Riggs, watched from the dry cover of the barracks doorway, their laughter a dull, intermittent sound swallowed by the drumming of the rain. They saw a woman in her late 30s, with plain brown hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. They saw a civilian contractor who didn't understand the chain of command, who didn't flinch or complain when they hazed her. What they failed to see was the calculus unfolding behind those placid eyes. She wasn't just standing in the rain, she was observing. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of tactical analysis, was mapping the base. The drizzle distorted visibility, creating blind spots between the guard towers, blind spots large enough for a two-man team to exploit. The runoff patterns on the asphalt revealed subtle, grating invisible on a dry day, information that could be used to predict the flow of incendiaries or the best placement for anti-vehicle mines. The way the wind whipped around the corner of the motor pool building created a sound shadow, a pocket of relative silence where a whispered conversation or the click of a weapon being armed would go unheard. Every drop of rain was a data point. Every gust of wind was a variable in a complex equation she had been solving her entire adult life. She cataloged the recruits' posture, their overconfidence, the lazy way they held their shoulders. Riggs, the ringleader, had a swagger that spoke a man who had never faced a true threat. His two companions were followers, their validation derived from his approval. They were children playing soldiers, ignorant of the world that existed beyond the pristine order of their training base. They saw a target for their mockery. She saw a security vulnerability, a weakness in the human element of the fort's defenses. Her official file listed her as Ilara Vance, logistics analyst, GS 11. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, sanitized and scrubbed, until it was as gray and unremarkable as her jacket. It mentioned a degree in supply chain management and a decade of experience with a private defense contractor. It was all true in the most technically correct and profoundly misleading way possible. The lines that were missing, the blacked-out, heavily redacted paragraphs, told the real story. They spoke of operations in hostile territories so classified they were never officially acknowledged, of missions where supply chain management meant calculating the fuel-to-weight ratio for a high-altitude, low-opening jump into enemy airspace, or ensuring a ghost team had enough ammunition to hold out for 72 hours until extraction. The cold was beginning to seep deeper now, a dull ache in her joints. She suppressed a shiver, not out of pride, but out of habit. Showing weakness, any weakness, had once been a death sentence. Here, it was merely an invitation for more scorn. She could have walked back inside at any time. She could have reported the recruits to their drill sergeant, a man whose bark was notoriously worse than his bite. But that would have been an escalation, an acknowledgement that their actions had affected her. It was better to wait, to endure, to let them believe they had won this small, insignificant battle. Patience was a weapon, and hers had been forged in the crucible of silent, lonely vigils, waiting for a target to appear in her crosshairs. The recruits would tire of their game eventually. The rain would stop, the world would keep turning, and she would remain a silent observer in the heart of the machine, waiting for the moment when her true purpose would be revealed. The summons came not as an apology, but as another command. A runner, barely old enough to shave, skidded to a halt before her, his boots splashing in a puddle. "Colonel Madsen wants to see you," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Admin building." Now, Alara gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She turned and walked, her steps measured and deliberate. She left no wake of anger, no trail of resentment. As she passed the barracks, Riggs and his friends fell silent, their amusement curdling into something else, perhaps confusion or a flicker of unease. Her utter lack of reaction was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. Colonel Madsen's office was a shrine to military order. Trophies gleamed on polished shelves, commendations hung in perfect alignment on the wall, and a large mahogany desk stood as a bulwark between him and the world. Madsen himself was cut from the same cloth, sharp creases in his uniform, a jawline that seemed perpetually clenched, and eyes the color of cold steel. He did not invite her to sit. He held up a thin manila folder, her name typed neatly on the tab. "Specialist Vance," he began, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. "I've been reviewing your file. It's sparse." Alara met his gaze without expression. "It contains all the relevant information for my assigned duties, Colonel." "Does it?" he challenged, tossing the folder onto the desk. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud. "It says you're here to optimize our supply chain, to identify inefficiencies in our requisition and deployment protocols. A civilian contractor. Yet you carry yourself like a soldier." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "The men, the recruits, are talking. They say you stood in the rain for an hour without moving a muscle. They thought it was a joke. I'm not so sure. Who are you, Ms. Vance?" The question hung in the air, thick with suspicion. Madsen was a creature of structure and hierarchy. He saw the world in ranks and insignia, in clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Alara, with her redacted past and unnerving calm, was an anomaly, a variable he could not place in his rigid worldview. He saw her civilian status as a weakness, her presence as an intrusion. "I'm a logistics analyst, sir," she repeated, her tone unwavering. "My job is to observe and report. Your last posting, according to this file, was with the Amaranth Group, a private contractor," he said, the words dripping with disdain. "I've never heard of them." "We value discretion," Alara replied. Madsen's eyes narrowed. "Discretion is one thing. Obscurity is another. Fort Gentry is a training facility for some of the finest soldiers in the world. We're the tip of the spear. We don't need a paper pusher from some no-name company telling us how to manage our supplies. We need soldiers who follow orders and respect the chain of command." His gaze hardened. "Your presence here was not my decision. It came from high up the chain, from a desk at the Pentagon. I'm being forced to accommodate you. But let me be perfectly clear. You are a guest here. A temporary one. You will perform your duties, you will file your reports, and you will stay out of the way of the real soldiers. Is that understood?" The dismissal was absolute. In his eyes, she was less than a soldier, less than a civilian. She was an inconvenience, a bureaucratic burden. He saw her quiet confidence not as competence, but as arrogance. He saw her discipline as an act, a strange affectation from someone who had never earned the right to it. "Understood, Colonel," she said. There was no hint of emotion in her voice, no anger, no defensiveness. Her calm was a wall he could not breach, and it infuriated him. "You will confine your observations to the supply depots and the administration buildings. The training grounds, the armory, the firing ranges, they are off-limits to you. You have no security clearance for tactical areas." This was a direct challenge, a deliberate hamstringing of her supposed duties. A logistics analyst who couldn't observe the end users of the supplies, the soldiers in training, was useless. They both knew it. He was setting her up to fail, to produce a shallow, meaningless report that he could use as justification to have her transfer request expedited. "As you wish, Colonel," Elara said. She stood for a moment longer, a silent figure in his immaculate office. She was waiting to be dismissed, a courtesy he seemed to have forgotten in his rush to assert his authority. Finally, he gave a curt wave of his hand. "That will be all." As she turned to leave, her eyes swept over his desk. She noted the brand of his pen, the secure sat phone in its cradle, the specific model of encrypted laptop. She saw a framed photograph of a younger Madsen standing beside another officer, a man with a familiar hawk-like intensity in his eyes. The photograph was old, the uniforms dated, but the face of the other man was one she knew well. General Thorne. It was a small detail, a seemingly insignificant connection, but in Elara's world, there were no insignificant details. Every piece of information was a potential key, a lever that might one day be used to move an immovable object. She walked out of the office and back into the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. Madsen's words echoed in her mind, not as an insult, but as a confirmation of her operating environment. He was the system, rigid, skeptical, and blind to anything that didn't fit its predefined parameters. He had drawn a line in the sand, confining her to a small, irrelevant corner of his base. He thought he had contained the anomaly. He had no idea he had just given it the one thing it needed most, the freedom of being utterly and completely underestimated. For the next 2 weeks, Elara became a ghost in the machine of Fort Gentry. She adhered to Colonel Madsen's restrictions to the letter, confining her physical presence to the sprawling warehouses and dusty administrative archives he had deemed her appropriate domain. But a cage is only a cage if you see the bars. Elara saw a lattice of information, and she began to weave it. She didn't just read inventories, she analyzed them. She cross-referenced ammunition requisitions with fuel consumption logs from the motor pool. She found a discrepancy. The 3rd Training Battalion was burning through fuel at a rate 20% higher than the 1st or 2nd, yet their ammunition expenditure for live-fire exercises was 10% lower. The official explanation was extended patrol route simulations. To Elara, it read as inefficiency. A convoy moving slowly, burning excess fuel, covering less ground, and engaging in less training. It was a weakness. She spent hours in the base archives, a place no one had willingly entered for years. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and forgotten history. She pulled the original blueprints for Fort Gentry, dating back to the Cold War. She wasn't looking at the structures. She was looking at what was underneath them. She traced the paths of old copper communication lines, long since decommissioned in favor of fiber optics and satellite uplinks. She memorized the layout of storm drains, maintenance tunnels, and forgotten conduits, the base's hidden circulatory system. To the staff, it was obsolete infrastructure. To Elara, it was a network of redundancies, backup systems that no one else remembered existed. Her observation of people was just as meticulous. From the window of the logistics office, she watched the daily rhythms of the base. She learned the guard rotations at the main gate, not from a schedule, but by observing the subtle shifts in posture and alertness that signaled the end of a long watch. She noticed that the guards on the night shift at the south perimeter fence were consistently slower on their patrol sweeps between 0300 and 0400 hours, a predictable lull in vigilance. She watched the recruits, the same ones who had sent her into the rain. Riggs was a natural leader, but a reckless one. He took shortcuts in training, relied on brute strength over technique, and fostered a culture of bravado in his squad. His team was fast and aggressive, but they were also loud. They communicated with shouts when hand signals would suffice. They moved through terrain without regard for noise discipline. They were a hammer, effective against a stationary nail, but useless against a target that could think and adapt. One afternoon, she was in Warehouse 7, ostensibly counting crates of MREs, when a young specialist named Cole approached her. He was quiet and studious, a soldier who seemed more comfortable with a technical manual than a rifle. "Mom? Specialist Vance?" he asked tentatively. Alara looked up from her clipboard. "Yes, Specialist. I was just wondering about this." He held up a requisition form she had flagged. "You denied the request for a new shipment of lithium-ion batteries for the portable comms units." "That's correct," she said, her voice even. "The existing stock doesn't rotate. You have 300 batteries sitting on the shelf, their charge slowly decaying. The oldest ones are nearly 2 years past their optimal performance date. You're issuing new batteries while the old ones become paperweights." Cole blinked. "But standard procedure is to maintain a stock of 500 units and reorder when it drops below 400. Standard procedure is inefficient," Alara stated simply. "It wastes resources and guarantees that in a crisis, you'll be relying on degraded equipment. My recommendation is to implement a first-in, first-out rotation. Use the oldest batteries first. It will require a change in habit, but it will ensure 100% of your assets are mission-capable." She turned back to her clipboard, the conversation seemingly over. Cole stood there for a moment, stunned. No one had ever explained the why of logistics to him. It was just a set of rules to be followed. This woman, this quiet civilian everyone dismissed, had just exposed a fundamental flaw in their readiness with a single observation about a box of batteries. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, a newfound respect in his voice. He walked away with the requisition form, his mind racing. He started telling others, not about the woman who stood in the rain, but about the analyst who could see things no one else could. Alara paid the whispers no mind. Her focus was on the larger picture. She was building a comprehensive threat assessment model of Fort Gentry inside her head. She knew its logistical weaknesses, its infrastructural vulnerabilities, its human fallibilities. She knew the storm was coming. Not a storm of rain and wind, though that was in the forecast, but a storm of chaos and pressure. And she knew that when it hit, the rigid by-the-book system that Colonel Madsen revered would shatter. The base was a ship with a proud captain who saw only the polished brass and the clean decks, ignorant of the hairline fractures forming deep within the hull. Alara was the only one charting those fractures, waiting for the inevitable moment when the sea would rush in. Her self-imposed confinement was not a punishment. It was the perfect vantage point from which to observe the first signs of collapse. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, rolling in from the west with an ominous, bruised purple sky. It was more than the forecasted squall. It was a violent elemental force. The wind howled like a predator, ripping at the corrugated steel roofs of the hangars. Rain came down in blinding, horizontal sheets, turning the neatly manicured grounds of Fort Gentry into a churning sea of mud. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. The cavernous, windowless room was a galaxy of glowing monitors, each displaying a different stream of data: weather patterns, perimeter sensor readings, internal communications logs. Colonel Madsen stood at the center of it all, a self-styled island of calm in a rising tide of anxiety. "Status report," he barked, his voice cutting through the hum of electronics and the distant roar of the storm. A young lieutenant, his face pale in the blue light of the screens, answered. "Sir, we've lost satellite uplink. The wind shear is too high. All external comms are down, except for the landline to Central Command. And the perimeter, sensors are going haywire, sir. Too many false positives from debris. We're blind out there. I have patrols doubling up, but visibility is near 0-inch. Madsen's jaw tightened. "And what about Trident Convoy?" The room fell silent. Trident Convoy was a routine training exercise, a platoon of recruits, including Private Riggs and his squad, tasked with navigating a 50-mile route through the rugged wilderness bordering the base. They were due to check in 30 minutes ago. "No contact, sir," the comms officer said, his voice strained. "Their long-range radios are offline. Probably atmospheric interference from the storm." "Probably?" Madsen snapped. "I don't deal in probably. I need facts. I need solutions." Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle the edges of the room's discipline. The junior officers frantically tried to reboot systems and reroute signals, their movements becoming increasingly jerky and inefficient. Their training had prepared them for textbook scenarios, for enemies they could see and plans that unfolded according to doctrine. It had not prepared them for the sheer, brute force chaos of nature, stripping away their technological advantages one by one. The landline to Central Command suddenly crackled with static and died. The last thread connecting them to the outside world was severed. The TOC was now truly an island, isolated and deaf. The controlled chaos was rapidly devolving into its less controlled counterpart. Madsen's calm was fraying, his commands becoming sharper, tinged with a desperation he was trying hard to conceal. "Give me a runner to the motor pool. I want a quick reaction force ready to deploy the second this storm breaks. Get me engineering. I want to know why our comms array is so fragile," he ordered, his voice echoing in the tense silence. It was in this moment of escalating crisis that Alara Vance walked into the TOC. She hadn't been summoned. No one had even thought of her. She moved with a quiet purpose that seemed utterly alien to the frantic energy of the room. She was still wearing her simple gray jacket, now dry, and carrying a small, heavy-duty Pelican case. She didn't approach Madsen or any of the senior officers. Instead, she walked directly to a forgotten corner of the room, to a dusty, yellowed panel on the wall labeled Auxiliary Systems. The panel hadn't been opened in decades. A captain, seeing her, moved to intercept. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. Civilians are not authorized." Alara ignored him. She placed the Pelican case on the floor, opened it, and removed a set of specialized tools. With a deft, practiced movement, she pried open the auxiliary panel, revealing a tangled nest of thick, antiquated copper wiring. Colonel Madsen finally noticed her. His face, already strained, contorted with fury. "Vance, what in God's name do you think you're doing? I gave you a direct order to stay out of tactical areas." Alara didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely on the wiring. Her hands moved with the swift, economical precision of a surgeon. She stripped the ends of two thick cables, her movements a blur. "Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the din, calm and clear as a bell. "Your satellite array is down. Your fiber optic lines are exposed and likely damaged by flooding at the North Conduit. Your radio communications are being smothered by the storm. You are trying to solve a 21st century problem with 21st century tools that are currently failing." She took a small, rugged-looking device from her case, a signal modulator with a hand crank, and began connecting it to the copper wires. "This," she continued, her voice never rising, "is a shielded hardline laid in the 1960s to withstand an electromagnetic pulse. It hasn't been used in 30 years, but it still runs directly from this TOC to an emergency bunker 10 miles east of the base, a bunker that has its own independent power and a redundant comms array on a different frequency band. It's old technology. It's slow, but it's reliable. And right now, reliability is the only thing that matters." The entire room had fallen silent. The panicked officers, the stressed NCOs, and the furious colonel all stared as this unassuming civilian analyst worked on a piece of forgotten history. They had been trying to force a signal through the storm-choked sky. She had simply gone under it. The pressure in the room had found a focal point, and it wasn't the colonel anymore. It was the quiet woman with the steady hands, doing the one thing no one else had thought to do. With a final, decisive click, Alara locked the connectors into place. She gave the hand crank on the modulator a few powerful turns. The device hummed to life, a small green light blinking steadily in the dim corner of the TOC. She straightened up and turned to the stunned comms officer. "Patch your headset into this port," she said, indicating a jack on the modulator. "Use low-band frequency. The signal will be weak, but it will be clear. Tell the bunker to relay a message to Central Command. Inform them of our situation and request they try to raise Trident convoy on emergency channels." The comms officer, a young sergeant, looked at Colonel Madsen for approval. Madsen's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, fury at her insubordination, but also a dawning, grudging realization that she had just achieved in 90 seconds what his entire team had failed to do in an hour. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The sergeant scrambled to obey. He plugged in his headset, his hands fumbling slightly. He tapped his microphone. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Fort Gentry TOC to any station. Do you copy?" A burst of static answered, followed by a faint, distorted voice. "Gentry TOC, this is Bunker. Read you faint but clear. What is your status over?" A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. The isolation was broken. They had a lifeline. Madsen stared at Alara, his expression unreadable. She hadn't asked for permission. She hadn't boasted about her knowledge. She had simply identified the problem, recalled a forgotten solution from the base's own history, and executed. Her intervention was an act of pure, undeniable competence. "Give me a sitrep on that convoy," Madsen ordered the comms officer, his voice tight. He then turned his full attention back to Alara. "Where did you learn this?" "It was in the original base schematics," she replied calmly. "In the archives. Section 7B. Public record." The implication was clear. The information was there for anyone to find. She was just the only one who had bothered to look. Before Madsen could respond, the comms officer shouted, "Sir, I have contact. The bunker is relaying a message from Trident Convoy. They managed to get a signal out on their vehicle's emergency transponder." Every head in the TOC swiveled towards the comm station. The pressure in the room, which had briefly subsided, now returned with a new, sharper edge. "What's their status, Sergeant?" Madsen demanded. The sergeant listened intently, his face growing paler with each passing second. He held up a hand for silence, scribbling furiously on a notepad. Finally, he looked up, his eyes wide. "Sir, their route was washed out by a flash flood. They were forced to detour east into the Black Creek Ravine. The lead vehicle slid off the trail and is disabled. They're no longer on military land, sir. They've crossed the boundary into the reservation." The news landed like a physical blow. The Black Creek Ravine was notoriously treacherous terrain, and the adjacent tribal reservation was sovereign land. A military incursion, even an accidental one, was a jurisdictional nightmare. "And that's not the worst of it, sir," the sergeant added, his voice dropping. "Their transponder signal is weak because they're taking cover. They report seeing two unmarked technicals, armed, moving towards their position. They believe they've been spotted." The room went cold. A lost training convoy had just become a potential hostage situation. The recruits, including Riggs, were stranded in a communications dead zone, with unidentified hostiles closing in. Their standard operating procedures, their training, their entire support structure had been stripped away by the storm. They were alone and vulnerable. Madsen's mind raced, cycling through protocols that no longer applied. He couldn't send a helicopter in this wind. A ground vehicle would take hours to navigate the washed-out roads. The QRF he had ordered was useless if they didn't know exactly where to go. He looked at the chaotic mess of data on the main screen. False sensor readings, dead comms channels, a blinking red icon for the lost convoy in a vast, featureless green expanse on the map. They were blind. His system had failed. His authority was meaningless without information. He then looked at Alara Vance. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the main tactical map. She wasn't looking at the flashing icons or the dead channels. Her eyes were tracing the topographical lines of the Black Creek Ravine, her expression one of intense, unbroken focus. In a room full of panicked soldiers looking at their screens, she was the only one looking at the terrain. In that moment, Madsen understood. She didn't just see a map. She saw a battlefield, and she was the only person in the room who wasn't lost. The atmosphere in the TOC had undergone a seismic shift. The initial shock had been replaced by a tense, focused silence. The casual dismissal of Alara Vance had evaporated, replaced by a mixture of awe and desperate curiosity. The recruits who had once mocked her now huddled over a secondary monitor, their faces etched with fear for their comrades. Private Riggs, the swaggering leader, was out there, and the reality of what that meant had sobered them instantly. All eyes, including Colonel Madsen's, were now on the quiet civilian analyst. "You see something, Vance?" Madsen asked, his tone stripped of its earlier condescension. It was not a command, but a genuine question. "The convoy's transponder is GPS-based," Elara stated, her eyes still locked on the topographical map. "It gives us their location, but not their environment. The hostiles know the ravine. We don't. That's the tactical disadvantage." She walked to the main console, her movements fluid and assured. The officers parted for her without a word. She tapped a few commands into the keyboard, bringing up a different set of overlays. Not military charts, but geological survey maps and old forestry service records she had accessed during her research in the archives. "The transponder is pinging from this position," she said, pointing to a blinking red dot. "The hostiles are approaching from the northeast, along the ridge. Standard flanking maneuver. The recruits are trapped in the ravine floor, with the disabled vehicle providing minimal cover. We can't get a drone up in this weather," the captain from earlier interjected. "No ISR, no eyes on target." "We don't need eyes in the sky," Elara countered. "We need ears on the ground." She looked at Specialist Cole, the young logistician who had questioned her about the batteries. "Cole, the seismic sensors at the perimeter fence. What's their status?" Cole, startled to be addressed, quickly checked his console. "They're still online, ma'am, but they're throwing thousands of false readings because of the storm. Falling trees, rock slides. Filter them," Elara commanded. "Ignore any reading above a 40 magnitude. That's environmental noise. I want you to isolate and amplify everything between 15 and 25. I'm looking for rhythmic, repeating impacts. Specifically, 2 sets of them, moving in unison." "What are we looking for?" Madsen asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The engine signatures of those technicals," Elara explained without looking up. "They're diesel. They have a distinct, low-frequency vibration. The rock in that ravine is primarily granite. It will conduct the vibrations. The perimeter sensors are sensitive enough to pick them up, even from miles away, if we filter out the storm. We can use them to track the hostiles' movement in real time." A wave of understanding rippled through the TOC. It was a brilliant, unconventional solution, using a system designed for one purpose: detecting footsteps at a fence for something it was never intended for. It was the kind of lateral thinking that didn't come from a training manual. Cole's fingers flew across his keyboard, his earlier respect for Elara now blossoming into full-blown reverence. "I've got it, ma'am. 2 distinct signatures moving along the northern ridge, speed approximately 15 kilometers per hour. They're paralleling the convoy's position. They're not attacking," Elara mused, more to herself than anyone else. "They're hurting them, forcing them deeper into the ravine, away from any possible extraction point." She zoomed in on the topographical map. "Here," she said, her finger tapping a specific point. "There's a box canyon 3 clicks east of their current position. It's a natural trap. That's their destination." The shift in the room was now complete. Elara was no longer an analyst. She was the de facto tactical commander. Madsen stood beside her, observing, his authority seated not by order, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of her competence. He was witnessing a master at work. "We have a QRF on standby," Madsen said, his voice now that of subordinates seeking guidance. "But they'll be going in blind." "No," Elara said. "They won't." She turned to the comms officer. "Get the convoy back on the line. Use short-coded bursts. We need to save their battery life." The officer nodded, relaying the message through the bunker. A moment later, he gave a thumbs up. Elara leaned towards the microphone, her voice low and calm. "Trident Leader, this is Gentry TOC. Do not acknowledge. We have you. We have the hostiles. Your job is to stay alive. I'm going to walk you out of there." She turned to the map. "Now, let's give our QRF a path. And let's give those recruits something to fight with." The quiet observer had disappeared. In her place was a commander, and the entire tactical operations center had become her weapon. Colonel Madsen made it official. Vance, he said, his voice resonating with a newfound gravity that silenced the last whispers in the TOC. You have tactical oversight. The quick reaction force is yours to command. Get my men back. It was a staggering delegation of authority, handing control of a military operation to a civilian. But no one questioned it. To question Alara now would be to question reality itself. Alara gave a curt nod, accepting the burden without ceremony. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, orchestrating a complex dance of moving pieces across a landscape she could only see in her head and on her screens. "Cole," she began, her voice crisp and direct. "Keep feeding me updates on the hostiles' position from the seismic data. I want to know the second they change speed or direction." "Yes, ma'am," he replied instantly. "Comms," she continued, turning to the sergeant. "Relay the following to Trident Leader. Tell him to expend 10 rounds of ammunition from his M249 squad automatic weapon. Fire into the north wall of the ravine. Tell him to do it now." The order was bizarre. Waste ammunition? Give away their position? The captain beside Madsen started to object, but Madsen silenced him with a raised hand. He was trusting her completely. The order was sent. In the TOC, they waited. The only sounds were the hum of the machines and the faint crackle of the comms link. 30 seconds later, Cole shouted, "Ma'am, I've got it." The seismic sensors picked up the impacts from the rounds hitting the rock face. "They're faint, but they're there. I could triangulate their exact position from that." Alara allowed herself a flicker of a smile. "Precisely. We just used their own weapon as a sonar ping. Now we have their exact coordinates. Not just the vehicle, but the squad itself." She turned to the QRF commander, a young, capable lieutenant named Harris who had been called into the TOC. "Lieutenant, your team will deploy in 2 light armored vehicles. You will not approach from the main road. It's a bottleneck, and they'll expect it. You will take the old firebreak trail that starts 2 miles south of the ravine. The storm will have turned it to mud, but your vehicles can handle it. It will bring you up on the southern ridge, opposite the hostiles." She brought up another map overlay, this one showing thermal imaging from a satellite pass she had requested hours before the storm hit, anticipating the need for it. "Your approach will be masked by this line of dense pine. The wind is coming from the southwest, so your engine noise will be carried away from them. You will have the element of surprise and the high ground." "What are our rules of engagement?" Lieutenant Harris asked, his eyes wide with admiration for her swift, brilliant planning. "Your primary objective is the recovery of Trident Squad. You are to avoid direct engagement if possible," Alara instructed. "The hostiles are trying to trap our men. We are going to trap them instead." She then turned back to the comms officer. "Relay this to Trident Leader. Fall back toward the box canyon. Move slowly. Make it look like a panicked retreat. Draw them in." It was a dangerous gambit, using the recruits as bait. But it was a calculated risk. The recruits, led by Riggs, were now part of her plan. Their perceived weakness, their panic, was being turned into a weapon. For the next hour, the TOC was a symphony of controlled tension conducted by Alara. She was a master of information warfare, using every tool at her disposal. She cross-referenced the seismic data on the hostiles with the slow, deliberate retreat of the recruits' transponder signal. She guided Lieutenant Harris's QRF along the muddy firebreak, using decades-old forestry maps to help them navigate around fallen trees and washed-out sections of the trail. At one point, the hostile stopped. Cole announced it, his voice tight with anxiety. "Ma'am, the signatures have stopped moving. They're holding position on the ridge. They're suspicious," Alara diagnosed instantly. "The retreat is too perfect. They think it's a trap." She paused for a fraction of a second, her mind processing possibilities. "Comms, tell Trident Leader to fire a red flare." "A flare?" Madsen questioned. "That will give away their exact position." "It's a universal signal of distress," Alara countered. "It's a sign of desperation. It will make their retreat look genuine. It will convince the hostiles they have them cornered." The order was given. On the seismic display, a few tense minutes later, Cole reported the results. "They're moving again, ma'am. Faster this time. They're taking the bait. They're descending into the ravine, heading for the box canyon. QRF, what's your status? Alara asked Harris via his vehicle's radio. We are in position on the southern ridge. The lieutenant's voice crackled back. We have eyes on the canyon entrance. We can see the flare's light. We are undetected. Hold your position, Alara commanded. Wait until both hostile vehicles have entered the canyon. Do not fire until our men are clear. The final phase of the operation played out in agonizing silence in the TOC. They watched two sets of seismic blips, the hunters and the hunted, converge on a single point on the map. They watched the QRF's icon remain stationary, a silent predator waiting on the ridge. Finally, Cole confirmed it. Both hostile signatures are inside the canyon perimeter. Alara took a deep breath. QRF, you are weapons free. Block the entrance. Disable the vehicles. Do not let them escape. She then switched to the convoy's channel. Trident Leader, at the west end of the canyon, there is a game trail leading up to the southern ridge. Move your men. Now. The response was a simple, breathless copy that from a voice that sounded remarkably like Private Riggs. The operation had reached its climax. The trap was sprung. The second, higher-stakes test had been passed not with a single action, but with a flawless, orchestrated display of tactical genius that had turned a potential disaster into a decisive victory. And all of it had been commanded by the civilian analyst they had left standing in the rain. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind died down to a whisper, and the torrential rain softened into a gentle drizzle, washing the grime from the air and leaving behind the clean, earthy scent of wet pine. The first rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, casting a pale, hopeful light over Fort Gentry. The crisis was over. The aftermath in the TOC was quiet, filled with the hum of restored systems and the low murmur of voices debriefing the night's events. Lieutenant Harris's QRF had executed their role perfectly. They had blocked the canyon entrance with one of their vehicles and disabled the two hostile technicals with precise fire. The occupants, a well-armed but non-uniformed militia group known for smuggling in the region, had surrendered without a major firefight. Trident Convoy was safe, accounted for, and en route back to the base, their fear replaced by a profound, shell-shocked respect for the unseen voice that had guided them from the brink. Colonel Matson stood near the main console, observing Alara. She was back in her corner, calmly monitoring the return of the convoy, her work done. She sought no praise, no acknowledgement. The intensity of the previous hours had receded, leaving behind the same quiet, unassuming woman who had walked in. But everything had changed. The way the officers looked at her, the way they gave her a wide berth, the way they spoke in hushed tones when she was near, it was all different. She had shattered their world and then calmly pieced it back together better than it was before. The door to the TOC hissed open, and a figure entered who commanded immediate, unspoken attention. He was tall and lean, with silver hair cropped short and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore the 2 stars of a major general on his collar. It was General Thorne, the man from the photograph on Madson's desk. His arrival was for a scheduled base inspection, but his timing felt like an act of fate. Madsen immediately snapped to attention. "General, we weren't expecting you until 0800-inch. Thorne waved a dismissive hand, his sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in the exhausted faces and the lingering tension. The storm expedited my travel. I heard you had a busy night, Colonel." The first report from the bunker mentioned a civilian analyst coordinating a rescue operation. I have to admit, my curiosity was piqued. His gaze continued to sweep the room until it landed on Alara. His eyes, which had been hard and appraising, suddenly widened in disbelief, then softened with a flicker of something ancient and profound, recognition, relief, and a deep, abiding respect. He walked past the stunned Colonel Madsen, his path unwavering, directly toward her. Alara looked up from her console as he approached, her expression remaining neutral, but a subtle shift occurred in the set of her shoulders. She recognized him as well. General Thorne stopped a few feet in front of her. The entire TOC held its breath. "It's been a long time," the general said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes, sir, it has," Alara replied. The file just said, Evance. It didn't. He trailed off, shaking his head slightly as if to clear it. He turned to a bewildered Colonel Madsen. Colonel, I need to see this analyst's full, unredacted security file. Top-level clearance. Omega Protocol. Madsen looked flustered. Sir, her file is heavily classified. I don't have the authority. I do, Thorne stated flatly. He turned to his aide. Get it. The aide, carrying a secured briefcase, entered a series of codes. The case hissed open, and he produced a tablet, which he handed to the general. Thorne scanned the screen, his expression confirming what he already seemed to know. He looked back at Alara, then at the assembled staff of the TOC. For the last 5 years, he began, his voice ringing with authority, the special operations community has had a ghost story. A legend. They talk about an operator who could see the entire battlefield, who could guide teams through impossible situations from thousands of miles away, who could find weaknesses in any system, any defense. An operator who went by the call sign Wraith. He held up the tablet. Displayed on the screen was a photograph of a much younger Alara, dressed in sterile combat fatigues, her face hard and focused. Beside it was a single word, Wraith. Wraith led the team that recovered the hostages from the Al-Qadir compound. Wraith planned the infiltration of the Red Talon mountain fortress, an operation with 0 casualties. Wraith disappeared 2 years ago after a mission in Eastern Europe went sideways. We thought she was dead. He lowered the tablet and looked directly at Alara, his eyes filled with an emotion that bordered on reverence. It seemed she just took a job in logistics. The reveal fell upon the room with the force of a physical impact. The quiet paper pusher, the woman they had scorned and underestimated, was a living legend. Specialist Cole looked like he might faint. The recruits who had watched the feed from the TOC stared, their mouths agape. They hadn't just been saved, they had been saved by one of the most elite operators in the world. The name Wraith was whispered about in barracks at night, a mythological figure, and she had been sitting in their logistics office all along. Madsen stared at her, his entire rigid worldview crumbling to dust. He hadn't just been wrong. He had been spectacularly, monumentally wrong. He had tried to confine a storm to a teacup. The drizzle had returned, a soft, gray curtain falling over Fort Gentry. It was the same rain from that first day, but it felt different now, cleansed. Alara stood on the edge of the same asphalt drill square, looking out at the same horizon. She had needed a moment of quiet, a chance to let the ringing in her ears from the TOC subside, and to feel the cool, clean air on her skin. Behind her, the barracks door opened. Private Riggs and his 2 friends emerged. They were part of the group that had just been trucked back to base, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, their eyes holding the haunted look of those who had grazed against their own mortality. They saw her standing there, a solitary figure in the rain. Riggs stopped. He looked at his friends, then back at Alara. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the terror of the ravine and the humbling revelation that followed. He remembered his petty cruelty, ordering her out here into the wet and cold. The memory now burned with a white-hot shame. He took a hesitant step forward, as if to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say? Just then, another figure emerged from the administration building. General Thorne, followed by Colonel Madsen, walked purposefully across the wet asphalt. Thorne's eyes were fixed on Alara. He didn't slow his pace as the rain began to fall harder, soaking the shoulders of his immaculate classy uniform. He came to a halt directly in front of her, his polished shoes inches from her practical boots. The rain fell between them, a silent witness. The recruits, including Riggs, froze in place, watching the unfolding scene. Colonel Madsen stood a few paces behind the general, his posture stiff with a mixture of duty and profound regret. General Thorne looked at Alara Vance, not as a civilian analyst or a subordinate, but as an equal. He saw past the plain jacket and the severe bun to the warrior beneath. He saw the years of sacrifice, the silent burdens she carried, the lives she had saved. Then, in the middle of the rain-swept drill square, in full view of the recruits who had tormented her and the colonel who had dismissed her, Major General Thorne raised his hand to his brow. He executed the sharpest, most formal, most respectful salute of his long and decorated career. It was not a salute given to a subordinate. It was a salute of profound, soul-deep respect. It was the salute a soldier gives to a legend. It acknowledged her sacrifice, honored her skill, and begged forgiveness for a system that had been too blind to see her. The gesture hung in the air, a stunning, silent thunderclap that dwarfed the memory of the storm. Alara's placid expression finally broke, but only slightly. A flicker of emotion, gratitude, perhaps, or the quiet pain of being seen after so long in the shadows, passed through her eyes. She did not salute back. She was a civilian. Instead, she gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. Behind the general, Colonel Madsen, his face a grim mask of humility, followed his superior's lead. He, too, rendered a salute, his arms snapping up with rigid precision. It was his own silent, formal apology. Riggs watched his throat tight. He understood now. He understood the nature of true strength. It wasn't about swagger or bravado. It was about the quiet, unshakable calm she had displayed while standing right here, in this very spot, enduring his pathetic attempt at humiliation. He felt the shame wash over him, colder than the rain. Without a conscious thought, he snapped his own body to attention, his back ramrod straight, and raised his hand in a salute as crisp as he could make it. His two friends, seeing his lead, did the same. And so she stood, Alara Vance, no longer an outcast, but an icon, surrounded by salutes from every level of the chain of command, from the rawest recruit to a two-star general. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the ignorance and leaving only a hard-won, silent, and undeniable respect. The moment lingered, suspended in the gray, damp air. The salutes held, a tableau of reverence against the backdrop of the drab military architecture. General Thorne eventually lowered his hand, but his gaze remained locked on Alara, a silent conversation passing between two veterans who understood the unsaid language of duty and loss. Madsen and the recruits followed suit, their arms dropping back to their sides, though their posture of respect remained. Alara's nod had been her only reply, but it had been sufficient. There was no need for words of forgiveness or triumph. The shared understanding in that moment transcended language. She had not sought this recognition, but she accepted it with the same quiet dignity with which she had accepted the scorn. "We need to talk, Wraith," Thorne said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "There are people who want to know your back." "My name is Alara Vance," she replied, her voice equally quiet but firm. "I'm a logistics analyst." It was not a denial of her past, but a statement of her present. She had left that life behind for a reason. Thorne understood. "Of course," he said, giving a small, respectful inclination of his head. "Specialist Vance, your report on the logistical inefficiencies of this base. I trust it will be on my desk by the end of the week." A ghost of a smile touched Alara's lips. "It will be thorough, General." He smiled back, a rare, genuine expression that briefly erased the harsh lines on his face. "I have no doubt," he turned to Madsen. "Colonel, my inspection can wait. Your primary concern for the next 48 hours is the well-being of your men, and I suggest you listen to any further recommendations Specialist Vance might have regarding base security and operational readiness. Her perspective is unique." "Yes, General, absolutely," Madsen replied, his voice hoarse with sincerity. His gaze fell upon Alara, and for the first time, he saw her not as a problem to be managed, but as the single greatest asset he had ever possessed. The humiliation he felt was profound, but it was overshadowed by a sense of awe. He had been given a lesson in leadership, competence, and humility, and he knew he would never forget it. As the general and the colonel walked back toward the admin building, their conversation a low murmur, Alara remained on the drill square. The recruits, led by Riggs, were still standing there, frozen in a state of awkward reverence. Riggs finally found his voice. "Ma'am," he stammered, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of her boots. What we did, there's no excuse." "I am sorry." Alara looked at him, her gaze analytical as always, but without malice. She saw not a bully, but a young man who had just learned a hard lesson about the world and his place in it. He had the potential to be a good soldier, perhaps even a good leader, once his arrogance was tempered by wisdom. The first lesson of survival, Private, she said, her voice calm and even, is to never underestimate your environment, or anyone in it. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and began to walk toward the logistics office, her work for the day not yet finished. She had reports to file, inventories to check, and a system to improve. The dramatic revelation of her past had not changed the fundamental nature of her present. The lasting image was not of the salutes or the apology. It was of her back as she walked away, a solitary figure moving with quiet purpose across the rain-slicked asphalt. She sought no accolades, no special treatment. Her reward was the work itself, the elegant, complex puzzle of making a broken system whole again. The rain had washed the base clean, and in the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new order had been established. It was an order built not on rank or regulation, but on the unassailable truth of competence. Alara Vance, the ghost, the analyst, the legend, had found a new kind of peace, not in the shadows of covert operations, but in the simple, profound dignity of a job well done and a respect that had been well and truly earned.